Why is she selling, if she's lucky, a few tens of thousands? And why is Britney Spears at that time selling millions? He said, you know, nobody would buy it unless it was meeting their needs. That's where we in education need to learn from the business world, from marketing, from industry. You know, these people work their tails off so that people really want their product. Why is it that they're not motivated, don't want my teaching? It's because I am not meeting felt needs. What I'm communicating does not correspond to their affective reality. It may as well be on the other side of the universe. It makes no difference in their lives, in their inner beings. So this means you have to create a space where they can open up. That's part of the reciprocity, of the synergy of teaching. So if you have a chance to see the film, you know, all of you buy textbooks. So I changed the formula. I said, what if the students wrote their own textbook? What if they wrote what they really thought about the subject? What if we created a non-threatening environment where they could say what they really believe about theology, about Bible, and uncensored, unedited, and unplugged. And so they would write it down in a stream of consciousness vein, whatever the subject was, and then when our dialogue partner comes in, and it doesn't matter if they've won Grammy Awards. Branford Marsalis has been my guest. He won 3 Grammys before he was 40 years old. I'd like to tell you, we had an experience when I wanted to help them understand jazz. And so we would go into a room like this, but there's no natural light. In fact, there's not even any windows. And I would ask them, come with pen and paper and blindfolds. And I would take an album. I would never tell them the title of the album. I would never say the name of the track they were listening. They would have no idea who the composer was, much less of the instruments. This is, you know, talk about a blind date. This was a blind date with jazz. And what I would do is I would have them all put on their blindfolds, and then I would turn out the lights. They had no reference point but the music. It's a primal encounter with the music. Now, they didn't know they were listening to one of the jazz planet's foremost musicians. And I said, write in a stream of consciousness vein how you experienced that. And they did, uncensored, unedited, and unplugged. And then, a few days later, Branford Marsalis came in. And I took this stool because Branford Marsalis and I were sitting on stools next to each other. And I said, Mr. Marsalis, I call these adventures in honesty. And I want you to know that the people in this seminar are uncensored, unedited, and unplugged. They didn't know it was you. They didn't know it was your composition, your album, and your track. And I asked them just to give us an honest answer. What do you really think about this? And I said, in that vein, I would invite you, Mr. Marsalis, to fasten your seatbelt. And so I read out what one of the seminar members wrote about a tune. It's on his penultimate album. The Last Goodbye. Well, the person wrote, well, I'm not sure that I can repeat what the person wrote, but I can tell you this. I read it out loud to Branford Marsalis. He froze. Nobody talks to Branford Marsalis like that. And I said, okay, as I'm sitting there on the stool next to him, I could either, you could have cut the air with a knife. I can either just try and diffuse the situation and move on to another subject, or we can take honesty in education to the next level. Now, I read these responses, these reflections as I call them. They're written in a stream of consciousness vein. I read them out anonymously. And I could tell that everybody was scared to death to say anything. Branford Marsalis was Jay Leno's band, but he left it because he felt he wasn't growing as a musician. Branford Marsalis tours with Sting and the Blue Turtles. He writes the music for Spike Lee's movies. And I said, exceptionally, I'm going to invite the person who wrote that to raise their hand. And for 90 seconds. And finally, this little lady from New Zealand sheepishly raised her hand and said, I did. And Branford Marsalis looked her straight in the eyes. Why did you write that? Do you know that broke all the ice? Then we could start talking to each other as human beings and not as some big jazz whiz, and I'm just this little who knows nothing about jazz. His manager told me he's got to be out of here at 3 o'clock. He's got to press. At 3:30, Branford Marsalis would not leave the room. He said, nobody has ever spoken to me honestly about my music. Yes, sir?
I have a question then. When you said that people don't learn when there's fear.
Yeah.
There was fear in the room.
There was fear. And that's why I felt we had to get beyond the fear. And the only way to do that was, and here I learned from Rudolf Bultmann, the German theologian. Bultmann wrote a formative text. Demythologizing Jesus. No. Now, my point here is not the theology of this Protestant, German, liberal theologian who did change the course of New Testament studies, but it is rather the paradigm of demythologizing. How do we create a level playing field where we can talk to each other as equals? Because only then can we dialogue. It's when we defuse the situation. So what I did was to defuse it, to demythologize it. That he's up here and you're down there and nothing can bridge the chasm.
But you would agree that they both had to have the courage to face that. Both partners, the person who asked the question and your person who was being interviewed, they both had to extend courage.
Yeah, and your name, sir, is? Jay. And you're a prof here?
I am.
And what do you teach, Jay?
Heresy. I teach in the Pastoral Studies department.
Thank you for bringing it up. Do any of you honestly believe we can learn without courage? No.
So what's the role of fear in learning? Because without fear, there is no courage. There has to be, what is courage?
It's stepping up to the plate and being a morally responsible agent that I own my convictions and I express my voice.
We can only have courage in light of fear.
I'm not sure that, first of all, I would see that as a reductionistic. I would see that as creating a black and white, true and false, right and wrong. I think the learning complex is much more multi-tiered than that. Certainly fear is a factor.
We're complexifying fear, or what are we complexifying? Just not following.
Because I don't think courage is simply a matter of fear.
I'm reducing fear, or I'm sorry, courage to just, I'm being reductionistic with courage and fear.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just trying to follow it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what I'm saying is courage is a lot more than the fear factor. Dr. Martin Luther King, and you have to understand that I did my PhD in religious studies, and I took a stand as a pedagogue. You saw the film. And that means you pay the price. And I'm paying the price. And it wasn't out of fear. It was, I have to do this. To be a morally responsible agent, I have got to step up to the plate and do what I believe is right. It's the cost of discipleship. It's the cost of conviction. So it's, I don't, that is not, for me, that was not fear motivated. I don't know if that answers your question. That was being morally consistent with my understanding of education. What good, ladies and gentlemen, would it be for me to teach my students to stand up and learn to think for themselves and make their own decisions if I myself did not live it in the face of institutional opposition? The best way we can teach is to live it, to be the example. That's what I learned from being born in 1950 and being an American by birth. And that's what I learned from Mahatma Gandhi, because I'm a religious studies scholar. I look at leaders who were ready to follow through with their convictions in the face of opposition. And the minute we give in to fear, it's game over. What is the opposite of fear, Jay? It's faith. I don't think you can be a teacher without faith. You'll never take the risks that it requires without faith. And teaching, you got to take risks. And I see the classroom as a living laboratory. I'm constantly conducting tests in pedagogy. What works and what doesn't work. I talked about experiential. I once had the entire football team in one of my classes. And I said, how can I get these guys beyond the fear that they feel as big, huge men being in this academic situation? How can I demythologize? Now, I told you I'm really into music. And I wanted to create a tactile experience. One of the most important senses that we have is the sense of touch. So do you folks know who Roy Orbison is? Crying. Do you know who Katie Lang is? Okay. Well, if you ever have a chance to see the duet of Roy Orbison and Katie Lang, these are two of the top singers. There's a song in there in which it says, just the touch of your hand leaves me crying. So I had everybody see the Katie Lang, Roy Orbison duet, and I had the entire football team standing, and everybody was touching each other, their hands, and we began to talk about the relationship between how we learn through what we hear and how we learn through what we touch. And it broke the barriers that were there. They were feeling very ill at ease, and this took them beyond the fear by opening up other means of learning beyond just the book. Now, your hand has been up for a while. And your name is?
Jordan.
Jordan. And you study Bible, theology?
I did Bible and theology and youth ministry, and now I'm in the Master's in Teaching program doing social science, Bible, and math.
And where are you from, Jordan?
Salem, Oregon.
Salem. Okay, good show. They don't burn witches there. In Mass, they did.
So just kind of going back to his question though about fear, I'm kind of just curious about, so what, if any, ability does fear play in learning? Because I feel like, and I'm kind of curious what your definition of fear is, because I feel like there's differences of fear in what I see in the definition of fear in Scripture sometimes, how people define fear in Scripture and how people define fear in maybe the world, or like I want to know what your definition of fear is, and if then it's like what it is, if there is any.
Okay.
To say it does play a part in learning, and because you also talk about teaching from the senses, and fear is a sense, and so.
No, it's not sensorially, it is not.
I know,
Okay.
I know, but I know, not from the same definition, but like, I feel like if we can learn from our sight and our taste and
Mhm, mhm.
we
The
can
ol-
also learn from humor, we can also learn from music.
Indeed, indeed.
And we can also learn from those different, I know, talking about senses in a different definition.
Okay,
of the word
okay,
senses,
okay, okay.
emotional,
Okay, yeah.
but it's,
Yeah, fair enough.
so, just kind of those three things, like, what do you think?
Well, let me give you, as sociologists would say, because you studied sociology, let me give you my functional definition, my working definition of fear. Anything that keeps you from moving forward. Anything that keeps you from moving forward. And if you have a chance to see the film, I'm not sure if it's going to be in the library where people could check it out and look at it. I had to come to terms with the reality that many of my students were living, to all intents and purposes, intellectual sclerosis. They were freezing up. How can I defreeze them, demythologize? How can they go to the next level? How can they progress? How can they move forward? Anything that keeps you from moving forward. That's my functional definition of fear. And I don't want to evaluate here in dialogue with Jay here. I'm not making a value judgment in the sense that, okay, what I'm saying is let's take the full package and harness it to the benefit of learning. But at the same time, let's be aware of what holds us back. You know, I'm a professional translator as well, so I translate from French to English. How many of you are teaching in Hispanic or other languages or cultures? Or any of you teaching? Yeah. Well, what is the greatest inhibitor to learning a language? You're so afraid to make a mistake. You don't want to be looked at like a fool because, you know, in French, well, in French there's a word ananas. Ananias is the word in the English Bible. You know, Ananias and exactly. Well, I remember being in a sermon where the preacher continued to refer to ananas. Ananas in French means pineapple. And so they were giving their sermon how pineapple fell dead after he lied. And so you have these kind of fears of making mistakes. But can we learn without making mistakes? No. And look I spent 15 years developing the dialogical philosophy of education. And let me tell you, it was trial and error. That's the name of the game.
So just to clarify, you're talking about fear, like, in your definition, it seems like things are keeping you from, things are holding you back. It's not really talking about the emotion of, like, necessarily the feeling of being scared.
Fear is a self-preservation device. There is a reason we have fear. It can mean the difference between life and death. And that's what, if you're into psychology, that's what what our species has in common with all others. This is a survival mechanism. So I'm not putting a value judgment that fear is ipso facto, by definition, bad. There is a reason we have fear. But it's just like a pathology. Do you know, when we have a pathology, there's very good parts of the operations of our body. But when one of them goes out of whack, then the good becomes bad. Fear is good in and of itself as survival. But what happens when it begins to control you? What happens? Now, probably you're mostly aware that that's what cancer is. Cancer is our cells that go out of control. The body turning in on itself. I would see fear as that emotion that turns in on us, against ourselves, doing us destructive when it gets out of control. All cancer cells begin as normal cells, but then they get out of control and they become life-threatening. So what's another functional definition of fear? It is emotionally life-threatening. It is affectively mortal to us.
Then what's the role of courage? You were about, earlier, if I understood you, you were about to say something
Courage is the mean by which we mature, by which we learn, by which we grow. Having that practical experience of making the decision, paying the price, learning the lesson. Yes, and your name, sir? Doug. And now we talked just a bit. Doug, you're from here?
Yes and no. Recently, I'm here, and I went to school here years ago.
Oh, okay.
But before that, I was a contractor in California.
California. Which part of California?
San Francisco Bay Area.
And which part of the Bay Area?
River City.
River City, okay. Yeah, well, Professor Coevisto and I went in Fremont, California. That's where we met, at John F. Kennedy High School.
Okay. You guys were in the same school? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's right.
I was the new kid on the block, no pun intended.
My question was, when you made the courage to switch your teaching method, what kind of reverberation did you get when you took that courage to stand and go, okay, I'm breaking out of the box, I'm doing things different in my class. What kind of reverberation did you get from the institution?
Okay, well, this is a good question, and it relates back to what Jay said. I didn't move into the dialogic philosophy of education for the fun of it. I did it as a morally responsible agent. When you have, as I did, a 21-year-old from London, Ontario, which has a wonderful university called the University of Western Ontario, and they're at your desk, like standing right here, and the midterm is coming, because you'll have to take this by faith, ladies and gentlemen. I began as a traditional teacher. 21 years old, a male student who has a mental meltdown before your eyes. Now, I'm not into space science, but Houston, we got a problem. And as a morally responsible agent, Doug, I've got to do something about that problem. The institution is a mighty machine. And I suffer no illusions that I'm going to change the institution. But I must assume my moral responsibility. If you saw somebody having a nervous breakdown in front of you, could you just, well, I hope you have a good midterm, and walk out the door? Can you do that as a human being? Can you do that as a pedagogue? And can you do that as a Christian? If we see the need right there in front of us, we got to meet it. And that's where, you see, what I look for as a religious studies scholar is where the rubber meets the road in religion. I want to see the practical application, the hands-on results. And so I saw somebody suffering in front of my eyes. And I work a lot with psychiatrists and psychologists extensively, because the fear factor, never underestimate it, and the ravages that it can wreak on a human being's life. You know, I had bulimia students, I had anorexic students, and keep in mind, I'm teaching in a large university at this point. When you're teaching an 8:30 class and your undergrads cannot face the day without having at least a quart of red wine and 3 joints, Houston, we got a problem. What can I do to put the love of learning back in their lives? So that, for me, learning is a natural high. How can I make it like that for them? You know, at the university where I taught, it's actually written in stone as you walk into the library. And that's most appropriate because we're in a library right now. And it's written in the masonry, and you're in construction, so you'll appreciate this. Beholding the bright countenance of truth in the quiet and still air of delightful studies. And when I saw these nervous wrecks, I said, how can I put the delight back in studies? By moving towards all the senses, by creating these experiences You know, and when you have jazz composers, musicians, when you have filmmakers, when you have actors, and we can learn from, you know, when I meet a human being, the first question I ask myself, what can I learn from Doug? As a pedagogue, we must always ask, because it is a synergy. It's never a one-way street. What can I learn from the human being I'm talking to now? And you can do a PhD and you can do your postdoc. The minute, you see, you would refer to this in philosophy as organicism. Learning is an organic phenomenon. Organic means it's biological, it's living, it grows, it's something vibrant. So the minute we cut ourselves off from that root of lived experience and of learning, when we think we have arrived, because you wrote the 425-page doctoral thesis, which I did, and what's really intriguing me now, and it may be your future as pedagogues, so are some of you thinking of going into primary education? Some into secondary? The secondary ones, I wish you much courage. Yeah, no, I've done it, and it's a real challenge. And maybe one of the greatest needs you could ever meet is to be that kind of Dead Poets Society teacher that you see. And that's what got me onto Ethan Hawke. I contacted him. I said, I got to meet you. and it went from there. In any case, that for me became, I began to look at the whole phenomena of cognitive acquisitions. You know,